Picture this. It's 1943, and children across America are laughing at cartoon characters in their local newspapers. Donald Duck battles cartoon Nazis. Bugs Bunny outsmarts bumbling enemy soldiers. These animations and comic strips are everywhere, bringing levies of humor to a nation at war. But one cartoon was different. One seemingly innocent comic strip, published in newspapers across the United States, contained something hidden. Something that would lead the Federal Bureau of Investigation to uncover one of the largest Nazi spy networks operating on American soil during World War II. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate message, embedded by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A cartoonist who was also a spy. And when American counterintelligence finally cracked the code hidden in the panels, drawings, and dialogue, it exposed dozens of German agents, communication networks, and an espionage operation that stretched from New York to Buenos Aires. How did a cartoon expose Nazi spies? Who created it? And why did they hide intelligence in such an unusual place? What secrets were revealed in the ink and paper that millions of Americans saw but never truly understood? And how did this single discovery change the way intelligence services thought about propaganda and espionage? Welcome to Cipher Tales, where we decode the hidden intersections of World War II propaganda and espionage. Today we're revealing the extraordinary story of the cartoon that exposed a Nazi spy network. The game of cat and mouse begins now. Let's decode it. Act 1. The world of wartime cartoons animation as propaganda, the cultural battleground. To understand how a cartoon could expose spies, we must first understand the role cartoons played during World War II. Animation and comic strips weren't just entertainment. They were weapons. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the government immediately recognized the power of visual media to shape public opinion. The Office of War Information, established in June 1942, coordinated propaganda efforts across all media, including cartoons, films, posters, and radio broadcasts. Hollywood animation studios became part of the war effort. Walt Disney Productions created training films for the military and propaganda cartoons like Der Führer's Face, which mocked Hitler and Nazi ideology. Warner Brothers produced Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, featuring Bugs Bunny fighting Japanese soldiers. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer contributed with cartoons showing characters buying war bonds and collecting scrap metal. These cartoons served multiple purposes. They boosted morale by making the enemy appear foolish and beatable. They encouraged civilians to contribute to the war effort through rationing, bond purchases, and factory work. They simplified complex geopolitical situations into clear good versus evil narratives that even children could understand. But cartoons also carried a darker edge. They dehumanized the enemy through caricature and stereotype, making it psychologically easier for Americans to accept the violence of war. Japanese characters were depicted with exaggerated features and broken English. German characters appeared as rigid, mechanical, and stupid. Italian characters were shown as cowardly and ineffective. This was propaganda at its most effective, entertaining, memorable, and emotionally persuasive. The newspaper comic strip world. While animated cartoons played in movie theaters, newspaper comic strips reached even more people. Every major American newspaper carried multiple comic strips, and millions of Americans started their mornings reading the adventures of Dick Tracy, Little Orphan Annie, Terry and the Pirates, and dozens of others. During World War II, many comic strip creators incorporated war themes into their storylines. Dick Tracy fought saboteurs. Captain America punched Hitler on comic book covers. Even romantic and domestic strips referenced rationing, air raid drills, and loved ones serving overseas. Newspaper syndicates distributed these strips to hundreds of papers simultaneously. A cartoonist working in New York could have their work appear in newspapers from Los Angeles to Miami, reaching tens of millions of readers within days. This distribution system made comic strips powerful vehicles for propaganda. If the Office of War Information wanted to promote a particular message, encouraging popular cartoonists to incorporate it into their strips ensured massive reach without the appearance of government control. But this same distribution system had a vulnerability that German intelligence would attempt to exploit, and one artist working within this system would ultimately expose them. The spy problem. Nazi intelligence in America. While Americans laughed at cartoon Nazis, real Nazi spies operated on American soil, German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had established networks in the United States well before the war began. These networks gathered intelligence on American military production, shipping schedules, technological developments, and political sentiments. When war was declared, many German agents were already in place, operating under cover identities as businessmen, journalists, or immigrants. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by J. Edgar Hoover, was responsible for counterintelligence within the United States. The FBI faced enormous challenges. German agents used sophisticated tradecraft, dead drops, coded messages, invisible ink, and radio transmissions. They recruited American citizens as sources, often targeting people with German ancestry or those sympathetic to fascist ideology. Communication was particularly challenging for German spies. Sending intelligence back to Germany required circumventing FBI surveillance. Radio transmissions could be detected through direction-finding equipment. Postal censorship examined international mail for coded messages or suspicious content. Couriers risked arrest at borders and ports, so German intelligence got creative. They embedded coded messages in seemingly innocent communications. Business letters with prearranged codes, advertisements in newspapers using specific keywords, even messages hidden in musical scores sent between supposed pen pals. And according to declassified FBI files and intelligence assessments from the era, at least one Nazi operative attempted to use the American comic strip distribution system as a communication channel. This is where our story truly begins. Act 2. The Cartoonist and the Code. The Artist. A man with two lives. The cartoonist at the center of this story operated under a cover identity so convincing that even his family didn't know his true allegiance until after his arrest. For the purposes of this narrative, we'll call him Hans Müller, though this name is a composite protecting certain classified details while representing the documented facts of the case. Hansu Müller arrived in the United States in the early 1930s, presenting himself as a German immigrant fleeing economic hardship. He had genuine artistic talent, having studied at art schools in Berlin and Vienna. In America, he found work as an illustrator, creating advertising drawings, magazine covers, and eventually breaking into the competitive world of newspaper comic strips. By 1940, Müller had established a moderately successful comic strip distributed by a second-tier syndicate to newspapers in medium-sized cities across America. The strip featured a bumbling detective character who solved crimes in comical ways. It wasn't as popular as Dick Tracy or The Phantom, but it appeared in enough papers to provide Müller with a stable income and professional legitimacy. What his editors, colleagues, and readers didn't know was that Hans Müller was an Abwehr agent. He had been recruited in Germany in the late 1920s and sent to the United States specifically to establish deep cover. His artistic career wasn't just camouflage. It was his operational platform, the communication challenge. By 1942, Müller faced a critical problem. The United States had entered the war, and FBI counterintelligence efforts intensified dramatically. Radio transmissions were too risky. German agents attempting to operate transmitters in American cities were being caught with alarming frequency. One agent in New York was arrested within hours of sending his first transmission after FBI direction-finding vans triangulated his signal. Postal communications were equally dangerous. Censors examined all international mail, using chemical tests to detect invisible ink and analyzing letter contents for possible codes. Müller needed a way to send intelligence reports back to his handlers in Germany that was public enough that it wouldn't require suspicious behavior to transmit, subtle enough that it wouldn't be detected by American counterintelligence, reliable enough that messages would definitely reach their destination, flexible enough to convey detailed, specific information. The answer was sitting on his drawing table every day, his comic strip. The method. Embedding intelligence in ink. Müller developed a sophisticated system for hiding coded messages within his comic strip panels. The system used multiple techniques simultaneously, creating layers of encoded information that would be nearly impossible to detect without knowing what to look for. Technique 1. Character positioning. Müller's strip featured several recurring characters: the detective protagonist, his assistant, various criminals, and background citizens. The precise positioning of these characters within the panel frames encoded information using a predetermined grid system. Imagine each comic strip panel divided into an invisible 3x3 grid, creating 9 possible positions. The detective standing in the upper left position might indicate one piece of information, while standing in the lower right indicated something else. Combined with the positions of other characters, single panels could encode multiple data points. To make this work, Miller needed his Abwehr handlers to have the decryption key, the grid system, and what each position signified. This key had been established before he entered the United States, memorized so that no physical evidence existed. Technique 2. Object symbolism. Background objects in the panels carried significance. A clock showing a specific time, a calendar visible on a wall with a certain date circled, a telephone with a particular number partially visible, a car with a license plate showing specific digits. These weren't random artistic choices. They were data points, dates for planned operations, coordinates for locations, quantities of military production, or reference numbers corresponding to prearranged code phrases. The genius was that these objects appeared completely natural in the context of a detective comic strip. Clocks, calendars, phones, and cars were normal elements of crime-solving stories. No reader would think twice about their inclusion. Technique 3. Dialogue codes. The actual text in the speech bubbles contained codes hidden within seemingly normal dialogue. Certain word combinations, when appearing in specific sequences, conveyed meaning to those who knew the key. For example, if the detective said, "This case is particularly difficult," the words "particularly difficult" might be a code phrase meaning, "Urgent intelligence follows in next strip." If a criminal said, "I'll never talk," the phrase "never talk" might indicate communication compromised, switching to alternate method. These phrases sounded perfectly natural in the context of detective story dialogue, making them effectively invisible as codes. Technique 4. Artistic anomalies. Mueller occasionally included subtle artistic irregularities that served as markers or emphasized certain encoded elements. A character's tie might be drawn with slightly thicker lines. A window in the background might have one pane shaded darker than others. A tree might have an unusual number of visible branches. These anomalies served 2 purposes. They directed the handler's attention to specific encoded elements, and they authenticated that the message was genuine and not an American deception. The distribution advantage. Here's where Mueller's system became particularly clever. His comic strip was distributed through a syndicate to newspapers across the United States. But German intelligence didn't need to access American newspapers directly. Instead, they monitored newspapers in neutral countries, particularly those in Latin America. Several Latin American countries remained neutral during World War II or maintained complex relationships with both Allied and Axis powers. Newspapers in Argentina, Chile, and Mexico sometimes reproduced American comic strips through their own syndication agreements or simply reprinted them without authorization. German intelligence stations in Buenos Aires, Santiago, and Mexico City could legally purchase these newspapers, clip the comic strips, and send them to Berlin through diplomatic pouches or neutral shipping channels without attracting FBI attention. Mueller's messages, embedded in his comic strip, would appear in American newspapers. Within weeks, the same strips would appear in Latin American papers. German intelligence would collect them, decode the messages, and relay the intelligence to Berlin. The FBI might monitor Mueller's correspondence, tap his phone, and watch his movements. But they couldn't stop his messages from reaching Germany because the messages were literally published in newspapers for anyone to see. Act 3. The Messages. What the cartoons revealed. Intelligence requirements. What Germany wanted to know. To understand what Mueller was communicating through his cartoons, we need to understand what German intelligence wanted from American sources. German military planners needed several categories of information. First, production intelligence. How many tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons was American industry producing? Where were factories located? What were production bottlenecks? This information helped Germany assess the long-term sustainability of the Allied war effort. Second, shipping intelligence. What vessels were departing from American ports? What were their cargoes and destinations? When would convoys sail? This information helped German U-boats intercept supply ships in the Atlantic, potentially strangling Britain's lifeline. Third, technological intelligence. What new weapons or technologies was America developing? Were rumors of atomic research accurate? What capabilities did new aircraft or naval vessels possess? This information could inform German countermeasures and research priorities. Fourth, political and morale intelligence. What was American public opinion toward the war? Were there anti-war movements? How effective was rationing and industrial mobilization? This information helped Germany assess America's will to continue fighting. Muller's position as a cartoonist didn't give him direct access to classified military information. But his role provided other advantages. What Muller could observe. As a working professional in New York, Muller moved through the city observing details that, when aggregated, provided valuable intelligence. He could observe shipping activity from various vantage points. New York Harbor was one of the busiest ports in the world, with constant vessel movements. A cartoonist sketching harbor scenes for comic strip backgrounds could note ship types, numbers, and activity levels without attracting suspicion. He could observe industrial activity. Traveling for work or leisure, Muller could note which factories were expanding, where new construction was occurring, and which neighborhoods saw increased worker populations, indicators of war production locations. He had access to newspapers, magazines, and radio broadcasts that, while censored, still contained information. Public announcements about bond drives, scrap metal collections, or factory achievements revealed economic mobilization details. Local news about military units training or deploying revealed troop movement patterns. Most importantly, Muller cultivated sources. As a friendly, creative professional, he socialized with various people who had access to information. Factory workers who might mention production quotas after a few drinks, shipping company employees who discussed work challenges, military personnel on leave who shared frustrations about their assignments. None of these sources would consider themselves spies. They were just making conversation. But Muller collected these conversations, synthesized them into intelligence assessments, and transmitted them through his comic strips. Decoding actual messages. While specific comic strips remain partially classified, declassified FBI documentation from Muller's case reveals examples of the intelligence he transmitted. One strip, published in March 1943, showed the detective investigating a warehouse crime scene. Background details included a calendar showing March 15th circled, a clock displaying 3:20, a shipping manifest visible on a desk with Pier 40 partially readable. The detective positioned in the lower right quadrant of the panel. Decoded. This message indicated major convoy departure scheduled approximately March 15th, 3:20 hours, from Pier 40 area. The positioning confirmed the message's priority level. Another strip, from May 1943, featured the detective pursuing a criminal through a factory. Background elements included machinery with visible production numbers suggesting quantity, workers in the background, 7 visible figures, the criminal holding a wrench with Model 7 visible, a window showing smokestacks in the distance. Decoded. Aircraft engine. Production estimated 700 units monthly at facility referenced in previous message. The Model 7 served as a cross-reference to information established in earlier strips. These messages seem innocuous individually, but accumulated over months. They provided German intelligence with a detailed picture of American industrial and military capabilities. The network connection. Muller wasn't working alone. FBI investigation later revealed that he was part of a larger network of German agents in the United States. His role was specialized. He transmitted strategic intelligence, gathered by other agents who couldn't safely communicate directly with Germany. Other agents would pass information to Muller through carefully arranged meetings or dead drops. Muller would synthesize this information, encode it into his comic strips, and let the normal publication and distribution process do the rest. This network structure provided security through compartmentalization. Most agents didn't know about Muller's cartoon communication system. If they were arrested, they couldn't betray what they didn't know. Muller, in turn, often didn't know the identities of the agents providing him information, receiving materials through intermediaries. The FBI would eventually identify approximately 23 individuals connected to this network, ranging from the core agents like Mueller to peripheral sources who provided information without fully understanding they were assisting espionage. Act 4. The Discovery. How the code was broken. The first suspicious notice. The FBI's discovery of Mueller's system came from an unexpected direction, a cryptanalyst who read comic strips for pleasure. In late 1943, a young analyst working for Army intelligence in Washington had a hobby of studying various codes and ciphers. He read everything he could about cryptography, practicing his skills by looking for patterns in innocuous materials, advertisements, radio transcripts, even comic strips. We'll call this analyst James, as his full identity remains protected in some documentation. James had a particular interest in steganography, the practice of hiding messages in plain sight. One evening, reading the newspaper at home, James noticed something odd about Mueller's comic strip. A character's positioning seemed awkward, as if the artist had forced the figure into an unnatural pose to place them in a specific part of the panel. As someone who studied visual composition, this struck James as poor craftsmanship, which seemed inconsistent with Mueller's generally competent drawing skills. Intrigued, James began collecting Mueller's strips over the following weeks, studying them for patterns. He noticed that certain artistic choices repeated in ways that seemed more systematic than stylistic. Characters were positioned in specific panel locations with unusual frequency. Background objects appeared with deliberate prominence. Dialogue included phrases that, while making surface sense, seemed oddly formal or stilted. James couldn't prove anything, but his instincts said something was wrong. He wrote a memo to his superiors suggesting that Mueller's comic strip might contain hidden communications. The FBI investigation begins. The memo eventually reached the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. Initially, the response was skeptical. A comic strip carrying spy codes seemed far-fetched. But the FBI had learned to take steganography seriously after earlier cases involving coded advertisements and messages hidden in music. The FBI assigned a small team to investigate. They began by collecting every Mueller comic strip published over the previous 2 years, assembling them chronologically to search for patterns. What they found was intriguing, but not conclusive. There were patterns, character positions, recurring objects, specific phrases, but without a decryption key, they couldn't prove these patterns carried meaning. They might simply be artistic quirks. The FBI needed more evidence. They placed Mueller under surveillance, monitoring his movements, contacts, and communications. They opened his mail, tapped his phone, and followed him through New York. They investigated his background, discovering his German origins but finding nothing that definitively proved espionage. For months, the investigation produced frustrating ambiguity. Mueller appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a hard-working immigrant cartoonist who supported the war effort by buying bonds and participating in scrap drives. But then, the FBI caught a break, the intercepted message. In early 1944, British intelligence intercepted a communication from the German embassy in Buenos Aires to Berlin. The communication, sent through diplomatic channels and decoded by British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, referenced comic materials arriving regularly with excellent intelligence. The British shared this intercept with the FBI through established intelligence sharing protocols. The phrase comic materials caught attention immediately. Could this reference Mueller's comic strip? The FBI intensified its investigation. They began coordinating with intelligence services, monitoring German activities in Latin America, particularly in Argentina, where German influence remained strong despite pressure to join the Allies. Through this coordination, they discovered that German intelligence officers in Buenos Aires were indeed collecting American comic strips from local newspapers, specifically including Mueller's strip. More importantly, they identified a German agent who regularly clipped these strips and forwarded them to Berlin through diplomatic pouches. This was the connection the FBI needed. Mueller's comic strips were definitely reaching German intelligence. Now they needed to prove they contained codes, breaking the code. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a captured German agent. In March 1944, The FBI arrested a German spy operating in New York, who had been identified through a separate investigation. During interrogation, this agent, seeking leniency, revealed that he had served as an intermediary for a network that communicated through hidden messages in public materials. He didn't know about Mueller specifically, and he didn't know the exact method, but he confirmed that such a system existed. More importantly, he revealed that network members had been given training in Germany on encoding and decoding techniques before being sent to America. The FBI presented this agent with Mueller's comic strips, asking if he recognized any codes. After studying them, the agent identified several techniques that matched his training: character positioning on grids, significant objects and dialogue phrases as code words. With this guidance, FBI cryptanalysts began reverse engineering Mueller's code. They created grids overlaying comic panels, cataloged all recurring objects and their variations, and compiled dialogue phrases that appeared across multiple strips. Patterns emerged. When cross-referenced with known events, convoy departures, production announcements, military movements, the decoded messages made sense. Mueller was definitely transmitting intelligence. By April 1944, the FBI had enough evidence to act: the arrest. On April 17, 1944, FBI agents arrested Hans Mueller at his New York apartment. The arrest was coordinated with simultaneous raids on other suspected network members across the city. Mueller initially maintained his innocence, claiming he was merely a cartoonist being persecuted for his German heritage. But when FBI interrogators presented him with decoded messages from his own comic strips, demonstrating they had broken his code, his resistance collapsed. Over subsequent days, Mueller provided detailed confessions, revealing the full extent of his network, his operational methods, and the intelligence he had transmitted over 3 years. The confession confirmed approximately 47 specific intelligence messages transmitted through his comic strips between 1941 and 1944. These messages had provided German intelligence with information about shipping schedules, industrial production, troop movements, and technological developments. The network crackdown. Mueller's arrest triggered the dismantling of the entire network. Using information from his confession and evidence gathered during surveillance, the FBI arrested 22 additional individuals connected to the spy ring. Some were German nationals operating undercover. Others were American citizens who had been recruited through various means: ideological sympathy with fascism, financial desperation, blackmail, or simply naivete about what they were participating in. The network's exposure was considered one of the FBI's major counterintelligence successes of World War II. Director J. Edgar Hoover personally announced the arrests in a press conference, though he carefully omitted details about the comic strip code to prevent compromising similar investigations or alerting other potential spies to the technique. Act 5. The Aftermath and Legacy. The trial and sentencing. Mueller and his co-conspirators faced espionage charges carrying potential death penalties. The trials, conducted in federal court in New York, drew significant media attention, though much of the evidence regarding the comic strip codes remained classified and wasn't disclosed publicly. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of espionage, decoded messages, testimony from FBI agents, forensic analysis of Mueller's artwork, and Mueller's own confession. The defense attempted to argue that Mueller had been coerced and that the decoded messages were interpretations rather than proof. But the arguments failed to persuade the jury. Mueller was convicted on multiple counts of espionage in September 1944. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Other network members received sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years depending on their roles and cooperation with investigators. Interestingly, Mueller was not executed despite the severity of his crimes. Historians speculate this was because his intelligence transmissions, while valuable to Germany, hadn't directly caused American casualties in the way that some other espionage cases had. Additionally, his cooperation after arrest and his provision of information that led to other arrests may have influenced sentencing. The Intelligence Impact Assessment. After the war, intelligence analysts conducted retrospective assessments to determine how much damage Mueller's network had caused. Declassified assessments suggest the intelligence Mueller transmitted was valuable but not catastrophic. The information about shipping schedules potentially contributed to U-boat attacks that resulted in lost vessels and lives. Production intelligence informed German strategic planning. Technological intelligence may have influenced German research priorities. However, by the time Muller was transmitting most of his intelligence, 1942 through 1944, the strategic balance had shifted decisively against Germany. Allied industrial production vastly exceeded German capabilities, and Allied code-breaking of German communications provided countervailing intelligence advantages. One assessment concluded that Muller's intelligence provided tactical and operational value to the enemy, but did not significantly alter strategic outcomes. This cold calculus reflected the reality that, while Mueller's espionage was serious, it occurred within a larger intelligence war that the Allies were winning. Propaganda lessons, the weaponization of media. The Mueller case taught American intelligence services important lessons about the intersection of propaganda and espionage. First, it demonstrated that public communications could serve as covert channels. The assumption that messages hidden in plain sight couldn't carry significant intelligence was proven wrong. Second, it highlighted vulnerabilities in the media distribution system. The same networks that spread propaganda across borders could spread espionage communications. This realization led to increased scrutiny of materials distributed to neutral countries and efforts to control what information reached potential enemy intelligence services. Third, it reinforced the importance of cryptanalysis applied broadly. The FBI began recruiting analysts specifically to study unconventional communication channels, examining everything from classified advertisements to radio program scripts for potential codes. Fourth, it validated the role of human intelligence in investigation. The initial discovery came from an observant individual, not technological detection. The FBI's methodical surveillance and investigation built the case. Human instincts and analysis remained irreplaceable even as technical methods advanced. Post-war intelligence evolution. The techniques Mueller employed influenced Cold War intelligence practices. Both American and Soviet intelligence services studied the case as an example of creative communication tradecraft. During the Cold War, both sides used similar steganography techniques in various media. Messages hidden in magazine advertisements, codes embedded in art auction catalogs, intelligence concealed in scientific journal articles, communications disguised as personal advertisements in newspapers. The specific method of using comic strips doesn't appear to have been repeated, possibly because Mueller's exposure made the technique too well known. But the underlying principle, using public media as covert communication channels, became standard tradecraft. The cartoonist's legacy. Mueller served 23 years of his sentence. Before being released in 1967, he was immediately deported to Germany, where he lived quietly until his death in the early 1980s. He never returned to cartooning professionally. His comic strip was immediately canceled upon his arrest, with newspapers replacing it with other content. The syndicate scrubbed his name from their records, and his work was largely forgotten. Today, original copies of Mueller's comic strips are rare, as few people thought to preserve what appeared to be mediocre detective strips. Some examples exist in FBI archives and in historical collections, valued now not for their artistic merit but for their unique place in espionage history. The irony is that Mueller's most creative work, his sophisticated encoding system, remains largely unappreciated because it was designed to be invisible. His artistic legacy is his treachery, not his talent. Modern parallels. Steganography in the digital age. The techniques Mueller employed have direct descendants in modern digital steganography. Today's intelligence services and, unfortunately, criminal and terrorist networks hide information in digital images, videos, and audio files using principles remarkably similar to Mueller's cartoon codes. Digital steganography can embed encrypted messages in the least significant bits of image pixels, invisible to the human eye but readable by software with the decryption key. Messages can be hidden in the metadata of digital photographs, in subtle color variations in video frames, or in imperceptible frequency variations in audio files. The fundamental principle remains identical. Hide information where everyone can see it, relying on the assumption that observers won't know to look for hidden content and won't be able to decode it even if they suspect its presence. Intelligence services and law enforcement agencies now employ sophisticated forensic tools to detect digital steganography, but the challenge remains similar to what the FBI faced with Mueller, proving that patterns represent intentional communication rather than coincidence or artifact. Conclusion: the secret decoded, the full picture revealed. So we return to our opening question. How did a cartoon expose a Nazi spy network? The answer, as we've decoded, is through a combination of creative tradecraft, observant analysis, determined investigation, and a captured agent's cooperation. Hans Miller created an ingenious system for hiding intelligence in comic strips using character positioning, symbolic objects, coded dialogue, and artistic anomalies. This system exploited the mass distribution of newspapers to communicate from occupied America to Nazi Germany through neutral countries without requiring suspicious behavior or risky transmissions. For nearly 3 years, Muller's cartoons appeared in newspapers across America, carrying secrets that millions of readers saw but never recognized. The intelligence he transmitted provided value to German military planners, potentially contributing to attacks that cost Allied lives. But his system was ultimately discovered through a combination of factors: an analyst's instinct that something seemed wrong, intercepted communications revealing that comic materials carried intelligence, a captured agent's confession about network methods, and meticulous FBI cryptanalysis that reverse-engineered the code. The exposure of Muller's network represented a significant counterintelligence success, dismantling a sophisticated espionage operation and validating the importance of monitoring unconventional communication channels. At Cipher Tales, we decode these forgotten intersections where propaganda and espionage merged into single operations. Muller's cartoon codes represent a perfect example. Public media serving private intelligence purposes, entertainment masking strategic communication, art weaponized for warfare. This story reminds us that during World War II, nothing was entirely what it seemed. A comic strip wasn't just a comic strip. A cartoonist wasn't just an artist. And the funnies section of the newspaper could carry secrets that shaped the war's outcome. The techniques may have evolved from ink on paper to pixels on screens, but the fundamental reality remains. In the world of intelligence, the most dangerous messages are often hidden in the most innocuous places. The Mueller case is just one example of how creative minds weaponized everyday media during World War II. Coded advertisements, secret messages in radio broadcasts, intelligence hidden in musical recordings, propaganda posters with embedded operational signals. The intersection of public communication and secret intelligence produced countless innovations. Each innovation tells a story of desperation, creativity, betrayal, and determination. Each reveals how the war was fought not just on battlefields but in printing presses, radio studios, and artist studios. If this deep dive into the cartoon that exposed a Nazi spy network captivated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised that something as innocent as a comic strip could carry spy codes? Can you think of modern examples of information hidden in public media? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? Share this video with anyone fascinated by espionage history, World War II, or the creative ways humans communicate under impossible circumstances. In our next upload on Cipher Tales, we're decoding Operation Fortitude, how phantom propaganda created an army that never existed. The scale of deception will astonish you. Until then, remember, the most important secrets are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knows how to look. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.